Welcome to the Growth Mindset Podcast with me, Sam Harris, your host. I invite fascinating humans from all walks of life to share their wisdom and unpack their mindsets and formulas for growth. So I'm going to read a nice review from someone in the world of the public on iTunes that's left me a review. And I'm going to do this each week. So today we have Erin McCullough. Sorry if I said your name wrong, Erin, but he or she says, interesting content and great questions. I love how Sam is so engaged in his interviews. Thank you. He always seems 100% in on the topic. That's not true. I probably never have a clue what I'm talking about. But anyway, I also really appreciate the questions he asks. The questions are introspective and give the interviewee an opportunity to slow down and create a thoughtful answer. It disrupts them from their usual dialogue and allows for some real meaning. It's personal. Sam also asks great questions that come up out of his interest in learning versus asking all the same questions to each guest. I highly recommend. Thank you so much, Erin. I've definitely done this more for myself rather than trying to just ask the same questions every time, because I got pretty bored doing that when I first started the podcast and was like, okay, I just threw away all my questions and was just like, I'm just going to have a nice conversation with people where I try and ask them the most difficult things that they haven't had before. I'm really pleased that you appreciate that because, otherwise I'd shoot myself if I had to go back to just doing the same damn things. And anyway, that's enough of me reading the reviews for the week. And if you want to really leave me a review on iTunes, that would be super appreciated because it really helps. Welcome to an episode of the Growth Mindset Podcast. Today we have Annie Duke on the show, who has won the World Series and Heads Up Poker Championship and one of the highest earning players in female history. And you just have done a lot of interesting things besides poker with your life and written some great books. And I'm just very happy to have you on the show to discuss lots of things from like philosophy, how to make decisions, finding your place in the world. So welcome.
Thanks for having me.
I'd like to have the guests just give a quick intro to their life of just like the most important bits.
I started off my life thinking I was going to be an academic. Well, I just didn't think it. I was an academic. So I did 5 years of PhD work at University of Pennsylvania. And I was in the psychology department studying cognitive science. And particularly, I was really studying learning. So right at the end, I was going off to become a professor, which was my intention, and I thought I was going to go off and have this academic career. And I got sick. And I actually ended up in the hospital for a couple of weeks and needed some time to recuperate. And it happened to be like right when you would normally be going and giving your job talks. So I needed to wait a year. And so it was in that year while I was recuperating, honestly, I just needed money before I went back and completed my work and got my professorship, hopefully. So I just had some constraints on what I could do because I didn't feel well. So I couldn't really do a 9-to-5. I didn't want to start a new career because I had a career waiting in the wings. So I needed something super flexible hours. If I didn't feel well, I didn't have to go in that day. So my brother actually suggested that I play poker. And just for context, I think that today in 2021, that doesn't feel like such an odd suggestion because for nearly 20 years, poker's been all over television and you can play it online and it seems like, I think, a pretty normal thing to do. So just to paint the picture, this was 1994 and poker was not on television and there was no internet. I mean, there was, but not one that would support the speed we need in order to be able to play poker online. That wouldn't have worked. So this wasn't anything that the general public kind of knew existed as something that you could actually do legitimately for a living. At the time it was if I said oh, I'm going to go play poker, I might as well have said I'm going into a life of drug dealing. I mean, that was kind of how it was viewed. And obviously you can see over the last nearly 30 years, the changes in the attitudes toward poker, actually the changes in the attitudes toward drugs as well. But this was 1994. It was also the war on drugs then. So the only reason why this was even something that I would have thought about, because it was a really weird thing for me to do, was that my brother had already been playing for 10 years. And he had gotten into it because he was really into chess. And he had gone off to New York to study with a chess grandmaster and then had found other games through that, poker and backgammon specifically. And he had become quite good. And so when I went to college in New York and my brother lived in New York, I used to go and watch him play. And so I was familiar with the game. I'd sat behind him and I'd watched him play quite a bit, which would be the only way that I would have had any access to poker whatsoever because I couldn't just turn on ESPN. So he suggested I play and he actually sent me some money He gave me some tips and some lessons, and that's what I did in order to make money during that year. And I was intending to do it in the sort of in the meantime until I went back to being a professor. And I ended up doing that until 2012. So the meantime turned into, what was that, 18 years of meantime. So I didn't ever actually go back and complete my PhD. And I think the reason why is that, I mean, there were a variety of reasons why, but poker is a super fascinating game. And I just found like the challenge of the problem to be amazing. And I loved it. And then the other thing I think that probably played into that was that I didn't feel well, like I was sick. And poker was really a place where you could hide kind of in the corners of society, which I think had some attraction to me at the time. So anyway, so I did that. I did that exclusively for 8 years. And then I had a really lucky thing happen to me, which was in 2002. A hedge fund actually asked me to come and talk to their options traders about how poker might inform risk. And that was a moment where, like, obviously I'd been sort of implicitly thinking about the way that my academic work might inform poker, but this was a place where I like explicitly started to think about it. And I realized that there was a really interesting conversation happening between poker and cognitive science that I really kind of wanted to like dive into that space and think about it. And so then for the next 10 years, I started giving a lot of talks on, how poker and cognitive science might inform each other, both in terms of things like risk attitudes, but also cognitive bias, how you could see those things play out at the table, how the kinds of things that strategies that you might use and tactics that you might use to kind of damp down the effect of cognitive bias and noise in poker might work really well in life. So I was giving those talks, started to write a little bit in that space, and I started doing some consulting. And slowly but surely, my life started to shift to like 20% of my time on poker and the rest of my time on this stuff. I retired from poker in 2012 and then founded the Alliance for Decision Education, which is a nonprofit trying to bring decision skills education to K through 12 in the US and around the world. And I had in mind, starting like right around 2010 or so, that I really had a couple of books that I really wanted to write. And one was Understanding Poker Through the Lens of Cognitive Science. And that's a book that I wrote, which was Decide to Play Great Poker. And I'd been teaching poker also. And so that was the lens through which I taught poker, was really thinking about it as a decision problem. And so I wrote that book, and that published in 2012. But I knew I wanted to write the other book, which was sort of the mirror image of that. Like, how would you think about cognitive science and decision making through the lens of poker? And that became Thinking in Bets. And then I followed that with How to Decide. And now I've got another book that I'm really deep into the work on. Hopefully I'll be finished with it by the end of the year. And I somehow wound my way around to becoming an author. Somewhere in there, I still do the consulting. I still do the speaking. The only thing I don't do anymore is play poker, because I went back to academics and now I'm back to doing academic research. So I did like come full circle on that. Just, I think, with a lot of really different experiences that inform my academic work now in a way that I think my academic life is richer for having taken the detour. But I know that wasn't 3 minutes, but I just like, my life is very windy. So I have to give you a windy version of it.
I would not have wanted it any other way. That was brilliant. Thanks so much. I was definitely like the whole to find ourselves and must first get lost kind of thing of like, you could never have like planned that. Or like if I told you, by the way, you've got all these interviews coming up, it would be better if you get ill for a bit and then your life's going to work out perfectly. You'd be like, what the shit? You can go away, Sam.
Right, exactly. There's actually a really deep point in there that I try to point this out to like my consulting clients and the people that I coach. And I remind my kids of this all the time too, that luck is just luck. It's kind of neither bad nor good, at least not obviously in the moment that the luck happens, right? Like, you need some time and space away from it to be able to see whether it's good or not. And there's a whole bunch of perspective. Like, good luck for me might be bad luck for you, or something that I perceive to be bad luck 20 years later, I might look back and say, oh, that was actually really good luck. Which is certainly what happened when I got sick. I mean, at the time I would have told you this was very bad luck. But when I look back, it's actually really good luck. So I always feel we need to sort of have a much more neutral stance toward luck and stop labeling it so much, and just kind of accept it and say, look, there's going to be lots of influence of luck in your life. That's just kind of the way that the world is. And just sort of stand back and don't come to those immediate judgments about whether it's good or bad, because time's going to reveal that. And like, one of the topics that I'm exploring in my new book is actually related to that, because I'm exploring what the benefits of forced quitting are. So when I got sick, I was forced to quit academics, at least for a while. And essentially what that did was it made me go and look at what the other options were available to me at the time in a way that I wouldn't have otherwise. And I think that there's lots of ways in which we neglect opportunities and we certainly neglect the opportunity cost of what we're doing. And we don't really look around and say, what are the other things I could be doing? Are there other routes that I could take that would make me really happy? And for me, I was forced to, and that made me go and explore other things. And I landed on something that I think in the end made me really happy. And obviously it didn't have to be that way, but if that hadn't worked out, I could have gone back to academics. It wasn't like I didn't have that opportunity to just go back the next year. And so I've just been learning like about a lot of stories about people sort of being forced out of what they're doing, and that their lives can really bloom under those circumstances, which is why I think that we need to just say like, I had luck, and try to resist the urge to say I had good luck or bad luck.
Definitely. We had the parable of like the Chinese farmer. It's like a 4-part parable where like this bad thing happens and everyone goes, oh, it's so bad, but it turns out it's good. So basically the parable is that there's this Chinese farmer and one day his horse escapes and it's his only horse and everyone's so sad for him and they give him like a gift and his whole village tells him how terrible it is and they try to consolidate him. But then the next day the horse comes back with 3 other horses that it made friends with on the thing and everyone's like celebrates and like, this is brilliant, this is the best day ever, oh, you're such a lucky farmer. And then the next day his son is trying to tame these new wild horses and he falls from one of the horses and he breaks his back and everyone's like, this is the worst thing ever, it was so sad for you. And the Chinese farmer's there like, yeah, I still don't know what's really happened, I'm not going to like judge it or anything. And the rest of it's like, oh, you crazy man, like your son's in pain. And then the next day the Chinese militia come around because they're recruiting for like the war where they're about to lose. So all the other sons get taken off to probably certain death in this war, but his son gets to stay at home living with his dad and he can't use his legs so much. And everyone's like, oh, a bit jealous of this Chinese farm. And he's still there like, well, what is like, I don't know if it's lucky or good or bad, I'm not going to judge. And the point is like, everything is sort of dependent on context of the future and stuff, and you just never really know straight away in the moment, and you should stop like being so thrown by like instant emotions.
I love that. I've never heard that story, but now I feel like I should use that. Like a lot of what I talk about is that we do better if we try to become more observers of our lives. And that's not to say like we shouldn't be actively making decisions or active participants in our lives. It's that we tend to do better when we can sort of see ourselves more from the outside. How does this like look from the outside? And I think that that's a good example of that. Like kind of try to disconnect from whatever that snap judgment is that you have in the moment or what your wants are in the moment and step back and try to see it from outside of yourself. And the more that we can sort of get into those other perspectives, the better off we are. And of course, that's such a huge part of being a good poker player, because what my hand is very, very small part of the game, because my hand is only good relative to your hand, number one. And so I have to be able to start to figure out like, what are the cards that you're holding? But then on top of that, I need to think about 2 things. What are the cards that you think that I'm holding, right? Like, how are you thinking about me? And then given who I know you are, how are you going to react to that situation? So I have to be a good predictor of how you're viewing the situation, what you're thinking about my play, in order for me to figure out how best to play against you. So it's all about perspective taking. And that's just, separate and apart from the particular point of my hand has no absolute value, right? Like my hand only has value compared to your hand. So sometimes ace high wins, and sometimes 3 of a kind loses. And it's because I'm matching it compared to your hand. So everything in poker is so much about getting outside of yourself and being able to take those perspectives and see yourself from the outside. And I think that that's such an important skill to take into your life.
Yeah, really cool. I'm liking where this conversation's going. And have you ever tried sort of meditation and these things to help you to step back and just sort of get out of your own head and look with perspective?
Yeah. So what I found, the way that my mind works is if I meditate, I fall asleep. Like the traditional meditation. Yeah, I fall asleep, which is nice. Like I don't mind it, but I'm not sure that's what the meditation is for. So what I found is that for me, the meditation more comes from activities that involve flow. So tennis for me, for example, it's a real flow game, right? Like when you're in the point, you're in the point. And there's moments where you're sort of popping out and you might be specifically consciously thinking about where the open court is, for example. But mostly it's like you're not, every time that you hit a forehand, you're not thinking about your forehand, right? It's like everything is about flow and just like allowing the stroke to happen and seeing the ball before you even realize that you see it come off the person's racket, so that you're already heading toward where the ball is before you've even consciously processed that that's what you're doing. And I get that also from other types of workouts. Pre-pandemic, I would do yoga. I haven't been doing it at home just because I don't know why. I've been doing is Ring Fit Adventure. on the Nintendo. It's so fun.
That's not what I was expecting you to say, but
I
wow.
know, right? What happened was right at the beginning of the pandemic, my kids came home and my daughter brought Ring Fit Adventure with her. And it was like really cold out. And so it was like really cold. It was even hard to take a walk. So she was like, you should try this. And I got really into it. But even that, like all of those activities can have real flow to them. And so that's where I sort of get my mindfulness from, is like, and particularly like with tennis, I do competitive tennis. So I do USTA, I do leagues, I do things like that. And that really requires a lot of sort of the ability to sort of be in the point, be in the moment, not necessarily get freaked out by the score or if it's like a big match by the pressure or anything like that, and just find a way to sort of play within yourself. And so I find for me personally, that's where I get that practice from. Other people are very good meditators. I feel I'm not so good at it. So
Yeah, nice. It's interesting to hear. Welcome to the favorite part of the show, free stuff. Today, you're going to be getting free job adverts on LinkedIn, which is great because 2021 is here, which marks a fresh start for your small business if you own one. And whether you're shifting business hours or hiring more remote employees, one thing that remains unchanged is the importance of having the right people on your team. When your business is ready to make that next hire, LinkedIn Jobs can help by matching your role with qualified candidates so that you can find the right person quickly. Your first job post is free, and getting started is easier than ever with new features to help you find qualified candidates quickly from the active community of professionals with 722 million members worldwide. So many that I can't even say it properly. And you can manage job posts and contact candidates all from a single view on the familiar linkedin.com. When your business is ready to make that next hire, find the right person with LinkedIn Jobs, and now you can post a job for free. Just visit linkedin.com/growth. Again, that's linkedin.com/growth to post a job for free. Terms and conditions apply. And now a quick break to talk about the benefits of CBD. For those of you who aren't familiar with CBD, it's the part of the cannabis plant that doesn't get you high, which might not be what you're after, but for me, it's great. And for centuries, it's been used as a completely safe and natural way to manage stress, help you sleep better, and improve focus and treat inflammation. Recently, I've become obsessed with canibrands.com. That's CANIBRANDS. Their CBD products are rigorously lab tested, endorsed by pro athletes, and just benefit your overall health and wellness. The majority of people who try Canny Brands products say that they're able to eliminate or cut down many of their other supplements and over-the-counter medications. For me, their Canny Sleep product worked amazing to help me fall asleep and just wake up feeling energized. I also love their Canny Fresh oral spray, which helps me be so much more productive during the day. So just visit cannybrands.com and use the discount code GMP25 for 25% off the cost of your product. That's CANIBRANDS.com. And the discount code is GMP25. The GMP stands for Growth Mindset Podcast. And yeah, get trying it today if you want to see the benefits of CBD. And I guess the other thing that sort of already ties into like we spoke about, like reading and like your life and just doing different things, is that you speak about the benefits of reading broadly and like translating that information into sort of different areas and like your life where you went and did completely different things, but then you took the skill sets back, and it's like the neuroscience and poker like had like a real sort of blend and like thinking of stuff. So like, do you have any good ways of combining that as like a piece of advice?
Well, first of all, I think everybody should read Range, which is from David Epstein. And that's really just talking about why it's so great to be a generalist. There's lots and lots of reasons going for some breadth. And that's not to say that you wouldn't ever specialize. I mean, when I played poker, I went super deep on it. Obviously, I was like really deep on poker. But, I had done a bunch of other things before that. I did a bunch of things in parallel to it, and I did a bunch of things after that. And even in terms of my academic career, when I was in graduate school, I was studying language acquisition, and now I'm studying group decision making and forecasting, right? So even there's quite a bit of breadth in terms of what my areas of study have been. And I think the reason is that there's all this great work now really talking about mental models and the way that that's really how we navigate the world, right? As we apply these mental models to the world, and this helps us to be able to think about and navigate through decisions in our lives. And the thing is, honestly, like the more models that you have to apply to any given situation, I think the better off you are. You're going to see it more clearly. You have more angles that you're going to be able to look at it at. And, for people who are familiar with Phil Tetlock's work, which if you're not, I highly recommend it, go read Super Forecasting. He talks about the fox and the hedgehog, right? And the hedgehog, right, like sees the world through one frame, like one big idea. And foxes see the world through lots of different frames and lots of different kind of ideas. And what you find is that foxes really have a lot of advantages in the world because they can apply different models. They tend to find innovation. Their forecasting is better. They can kind of foresee the way that the future might turn out given like any option they're considering a lot better. And I think it's because you just have a lot more like angles that you can see the world. And you can see some of this happening. Like I know in finance, some of the best people in finance started off as like biologists because they see biological systems similarly to financial systems. They can draw those parallels in a way that allows them to see that world in a way that somebody, for example, maybe who was a finance major would not necessarily see the world. And so I just think that the more ways that you have to look at the world, the better off you are in terms of your own decision making. And then the other benefit of that, of course, is that one of the things that allows us to just be a better decision maker is to be wealthy, not in money. I mean, although obviously money's not bad, but wealthy in options. So particularly when you have a world that's changing really rapidly, which ours is right now, the more options that you have available to you, the more things that you could sort of jump off here and go over to something else that you might want to try, the better off you're going to be. And that requires more breadth. Like if the only thing that you've ever done in your life is learn how to code in C++. If you want to do something else, you kind of have to start from scratch, right? Because that's the skill that you have and that's it. And obviously there's lots and lots of jobs for people who code. But if you want to have options to be able to sort of like, let's say that for some reason that doesn't make you happy anymore, or for some reason those jobs go away, or for some reason, whatever, having the option to be able to move on to something else and to switch what you're doing is just really, really valuable. And you're going to get that by having more breadth. So it's really good for your thinking, but it's also just really good for your life in terms of your outcomes. You're going to perform better in your job when you read broadly, when you have lots of models, when you sort of thought about lots of different areas, and you're just going to have more options available to you in terms of the kinds of things that you might want to do. And so I'm all for it. You should read Range. You should read Super Forecasting. That will help make the case probably better than I do.
Yeah, great books. And yeah, it's really nice breakdown there of the whole sort of area of building the different mental models to see the world, because it's really fascinating. I studied science, and so you kind of look at the world from a science perspective, but then whilst I was at uni, I did a bit of like video production, but like every movie you watch, you kind of like are analyzing how that works, and just like the funny lenses that you build just from like a few experiences that you have, and just like the more things you do, like the more capacity you have for thinking about stuff and empathizing and understanding, and there's more like patterns.
And we know, I mean, everybody knows people who look at the world only through one thing.
Yeah.
Know those people. It's like one big idea. And, Phil Tetlock talks about this, he says like when you do that, like when you have really deep subject matter expertise, you can think about that as having like sort of dug a trench, right? So the more expertise you get, sort of literally the deeper you get on it, you're like deeper down into the trench. And what ends up happening is that we sort of have this intuition that when new information comes in, that we'll, observe the information like an object, and sort of think about it in some sort of logical way, rationally, objectively. And then depending on the information, we'll either like incorporate that into our model or we'll change our model. But that's not actually what happens. It's that the information always gets incorporated into the model in some way. We don't actually change the model. So we might reject the information, we might dispute it, or we'll interpret it in a way that fits really nicely into our model that will actually sort of reconfirm and deepen the trench. And of course, that's a big problem, because if you come across information that should cause you to change your mind, the subject matter expertise that you have, that very subject matter expertise could actually stop you from changing your mind. So it becomes like this kind of circular problem. And you can, like he talks about, so he has a book called Expert Political Judgment, which is, probably a little wonkier than Super Forecasting, but like a really, really good read if you're really into this kind of topic. And, he talks about people who were Cold War experts, right? And they viewed the relationship between America and Russia through the lens of the Cold War. And when Perestroika came, they were sort of lost, right? Like they didn't really know how to sort of interpret this new world. And they wanted to persist in thinking about it as, still the Cold War. And not only that, they didn't see it coming. Because if you view the world through this lens of the Cold War, even when there are signs that something's happening, you don't see it coming because you don't incorporate those signals properly, right? So that's obviously kind of on a big world stage, but we're doing that in our lives all the time, like in small ways, because we all have, I mean, I guess you could call them strong opinions, right? But we all have an idea about the way that the world works. And we have very strongly held beliefs. And this is particularly true, like when it comes to political beliefs, for example, or even like beliefs about health, right? Like we've all met those people who are on a keto diet, let's say. I have no truck with you if you're on a keto diet. What I have truck with you is when you're telling me that my diet sucks, because you can't allow that there would be reasonable other choices besides keto, because you're so endowed and so committed to that point of view about the world that when other people are doing other things, or there's information that there's other ways that you could achieve health, or there's other ways, whatever, you'll like work to reject it. And I'm sure you know people like that, right? Like they've got a particular fitness routine, and what they tell you is that any other fitness routine is no good, right? Or, a particular dietary, whatever. And then obviously when you start to get into things like political opinions, and what ends up happening is that we all sort of become siloed in these ideas. And then as information is coming in, we now reason about that information in a way to support the belief that we already have.
Yeah, confirmation bias. That's fascinating. And it is a really hard one. And I think like a lot of the biggest innovators and stuff have been people that have come from a different field and then like arrived in a new field and actually really disrupted it because they've had like a new lens, as opposed to people that are ingrained with just how things are.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's like someone who's completely new to a problem is going to see things very differently. Someone who comes from a different field, so they have a different frame that they're applying to it, are going to see things really differently.
Yeah, definitely is. And having like completely different people in the room, I can't remember what examples it was, but yeah, doesn't matter. Something involving some sort of decision, but then trying to get like major people involved in it instead, or the other way around. And I can't remember what the story is. So great. Good one, Sam. But yeah, this is something that was kind of annoying me in terms of like the whole, like just way that you get information has been really annoying in sort of Facebook and these things, I guess, is pretty spoken about these days. And so I've currently what I'm starting is like a company that actually listen to podcasts, but it's like a sort of a social network where you can see what other people are listening to and you can engage around it and like listen together, but also just like learn from other people and see what they're thinking. Because I've been doing this book club with a friend. Like it's a podcast where we read a book a week, and then like I learned so much more by talking about it with my friend and seeing what he thinks and just getting his opinions as opposed to just my own. Because like I just sort of I think my own things and like I have some good ideas, but like I've just learned so much more by discussing stuff. So I'm trying to like make it easier for others to do that. And then I want to try and score where podcasts are on like the political spectrum or whatever. So you can then like gamify sort of forcing yourself to listen to other things that are different. And it just also helps with discovery, because when you listen to podcasts, you just subscribe to the things that you know, and it's hard to discover other things because you're just in this world by yourself. There's nothing besides like, oh, it's in the top charts, but no one cares about the charts on podcasts. It's like, I'm not going to listen to an ad just because it was in the charts. And so, but when your friend says, oh, this has like some really things that you think about, like you'd love this, like you start discovering so much more. So trying to fix those things, and it's just like really nice for discussions and stuff.
All right, so there's two things that I think about from what you just said. The first is that I think what you just described in a really nice colloquial way, the inside and outside view, right? So the inside view is like the world from our own perspective. This is where like all the bias is going to live in terms of confirmation bias and things like that. We're trying to confirm our own beliefs. The outside view is the world separate and apart from our own perspective. And that's kind of two things, what's true of the world in general, but also other people's perspectives on the same situation. So when you talk about, you learn so much more about a book when you read it with somebody else and you get to hear their opinions, that's exactly what that is, right? Like you're interpreting that book through your own lens and through your own perspective and your own experiences and your own beliefs and your own biases. But obviously your friend doesn't share those with you. I mean, there's some overlap, but that he's going to have a different point of view. And so when you allow those to collide, you can see how the learning explodes, because that's allowing you to get outside of your own perspective and start to see the world in the space between those two things, right? So that's just like really important conceptually for people who want to become better decision makers, is this idea of like, get other people's perspectives. That's the single biggest thing that you can do in order to improve your decision making. The second thing that came to mind that I actually just want to ask you about is that, and this is something that I've struggled with, is when you think about scoring podcasts on the political spectrum and then sort of gamifying, challenging people to kind of spread their listening out across that. I'm just curious as to how you deal with people who don't argue in good faith. So this is something that I've struggled with, right? So I'm right there with you. I think that people should be interacting with points of view that are much more disparate from their own point of view than they actually are, right? But then there's this issue of, well, how far are you supposed to go? Because there's people who certainly aren't arguing in any kind of good faith, right? So then what do you do?
Definitely. Hard question. And certainly, I mean, we spoke about Sam Harris a bit before this, and he's had the odd person on his podcast that just doesn't argue in good faith, and it just makes a terrible podcast because they just end up shouting at each other. And you're like, guys, like, and it's a hard one, especially as in you try to be empathetic, but like people like us, I think, are very curious, and you just like, it's quite interesting to just hear what other people think and not be too judgmental about it. But then some people just aren't like that.
Yeah. I mean, I find this happening to me on Twitter where I'll follow someone who's, who has really different views than I do. And then at some point, I just stop following them, not because they have different views. I have lots of people on there who have different views than I do, but because I don't feel like they're arguing in good faith. But then I say to myself, well, how do I know that? Right. So, like, I'll just give you an example, like Dinesh D'Souza. So I followed him for a while because I thought, oh, I should really know what somebody who's really far apart from me is saying. But then he keeps talking about how the Democrats are the party of slavery because, essentially the argument, because in 1860, they did whatever, or in the 1950s, they had the Southern strategy or whatever, like because there were Dixiecrats, so, and I'm like, but that, what are you saying? Like, people can't change. That doesn't make any sense. Like, we should ignore what somebody is doing today and say, well, in 1960, you were, because in the 1860s, the Democrats voted against slavery. Somehow the Democrats were actually the reason. Right. And I'm like, that's not even an argument. I don't even understand what you're saying. And then he'll follow it with, and the history books don't talk about the fact that the Democrats were the party of slavery, which is just demonstrably untrue. Right. When you go and look at it, you're like, obviously Lincoln was a Republican, right? So like, it's very clear in the history books that the Democrats at that time, many, many years ago, were totally pro-slavery. That's true. But, there was a shift that happened with Lyndon Johnson, basically, like in the 1960s, there were some changes that happened. So I look at that and I say, okay, so now what am I supposed to do? Because clearly, that's not a good faith argument, but he's also quite influential, in that world. So do I like clog up my stream with someone who's clearly not arguing in good faith?
If it annoys you and you recognize yourself getting annoyed, then probably stop, because it's not worth like the mental strain. But then should it even be annoying you in the first place? Because nothing is inherently good or bad. And as we know, in perspective and like the time that you spend learning about these things, if it doesn't annoy you, then that's useful. But if it gives you a bad day every day, then just like
no. But how would you score it? If you want to score things on the political spectrum, I think that I would say, like, not just right and left, but I would have some sort of like good faith, not good faith score. Because, by the way, this isn't just a Dinesh D'Souza problem. There are plenty of people on the other side of the aisle who are also not arguing in good faith, right? Like this is something that is, across the board, in the same way that I think about, like, you can get authoritarianism on the right, like that would be like Hitler, and on the left, that would be Stalin, right? So like there's something that's separate and apart from the sort of right left spectrum that has to do with good faith, not good faith, and like authoritarian, non-authoritarian, which I think are I think those two are probably a little bit linked, maybe, but I don't know. But I just wonder if you've thought about like thinking about it more as a space as opposed to like a line.
I have now. Yeah, because it has been like awkward, and have been thinking about how do you judge these things, because there's left and right, but then there is the sort of the grades of how the arguments are presented and things.
And I'll listen to someone who has different points of view all day. Like, I follow lots and lots of people who have very different points of view than I do, but I need them to be trying, right? Like, I need them to actually be engaging with the ideas and be willing to listen to the other side.
Exactly. It's easier when people have arguments to be like, okay, how much is this person actually listening to the other side and those things? And that's great. But when it's sort of just someone talking about themselves on a podcast or something, it's a bit harder. And some people really like just back themselves up with like flawed logic. And even Jordan Peterson, some of the things he says, you're actually like, actually, you kind of haven't said anything. You've just sort of said some stuff and like agree with yourself a lot, but it didn't really make sense if you sort of go into it. And but he is generally like a good person.
Have you ever heard the term paltering?
It sounds familiar. I'm really bad at English, and so I'm just going to say nope, and you can explain it to me.
Okay, so you're going to like this term. So I got this term. There's a great paper from Marie Schweitzer, who's a professor over at Wharton, called I think it's called Artful Paltering. But paltering is a really great concept to have, which is when somebody argues where there's some kernel of truth in what they're saying, like sort of there's a core in there that's true, but then the places that they take it and sort of what they draw from it is not true. And I think that that's a really interesting form of like not good faith So it's like paltering would be like double speak, basically.
Cool. And like sort of, and the opposite being like straw man, sort of side of like just like a slight weakness in your argument, and then like saying your entire argument's crap just because of like this one thing. You're like, well, no, just because of the one thing, it doesn't mean like nothing makes sense.
Yeah. So it's like you'll have something that's in there that's kind of true, but you're leaving things out. It's meant to fool somebody into thinking that the thing you're saying is really true. And at the center of it is something that's true, but then you're like double speaking around it. And then the other thing is the Mott and Bailey, that it's a very, very good mental model for people to think about in terms of this problem of good faith argumentation. So basically, what it is like you'll have two positions where one is like easily defensible and narrow. So that's the Mott. So the Mott and Bailey, it's like in medieval times, the Mott was a castle that was up on a hill, and the Bailey was like the village beneath it. So the Mott is really easy to defend, right? Because it's up on the hill, and then the Bailey is harder to defend. So this would be like where you have some sort of argument that's true and makes sense, but then you expand it to something that isn't so true. And then when somebody challenges your position, you retreat back to the more defensible position. So you claim that that was the position that you were sort of trying to take. So an example of that would be the classic example of that is that right and wrong, so, some moral positions are social constructs, right? So the society itself sort of will decide what's right and wrong. So that would be like, for example, like in medieval times, it was fine to burn cats. That was morally acceptable. Obviously today that's not. So you can see that there's kind of a social aspect to right and wrong. Okay, so that would be the Mott argument. So that's very easily defensible. The Bailey argument is there, so therefore right and wrong doesn't exist. There is no right and wrong, right? So obviously you can see how once you sort of understand that, you see that in politics or in political argumentation all the time.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I wish I'd done debating when I was younger, in hindsight.
Yeah, debaters use the Mott and Bailey a lot.
Yeah. Did you do any other things did you go into sort of just side things like practicing public speaking and debating, all those kind of things?
So I never myself did debate. My dad was the debate coach at my high school. So every family dinner was a debate. So I guess I debated in that way. I think that if people could come over to my house for dinner, they would have been very stressed out by our dinner conversation because we debated at dinner and then we played cards afterwards. So, but no, I mean, obviously I do tons of public speaking, but my public speaking came from teaching. So when I was at Penn, obviously I also had to teach classes. And so I learned to be a public speaker from that.
Yeah. So it's a fun skill to learn. And I got into it the last few years and started doing stand-up comedy this year, well, last year now, because it's 2021 now. And that was like super scary. I used to be really just bad at talking in general and couldn't even do public speaking. So it was definitely trying to imagine myself as someone doing stand-up comedy a few years ago would blow my brain. And but yeah, it's just nice to range, just try completely different things. And I think it's nice to kind of understand how jokes get made and what people react to. And it also really helps with your whole sort of confidence of just like getting up there and saying a shit joke and okay, the life doesn't end.
Yeah, I think that's amazing. So kudos to you, because I think that a lot of the reason that people won't explore other things is because they're afraid of failing. And what they don't realize, I'm sure you know this now. It's like, so if you get up and bomb, so what? Right? Like you tried it. Like if it works out, it's really great. If it doesn't work out, so what? It's not going to have any long-term effect on your life if getting up and trying stand-up comedy doesn't work, right? If it turns out you don't like it. So like, I'm just a big proponent of like, try stuff. As you can tell from my life, because my life has probably been one big, long try stuff.
Definitely. Yeah, me too. I think once you can have like the lens or like mental model whereby anything that's scary probably is worth doing and that you're going to have like something really cool on the other side of it, like the other side of your fear is like where the awesome stuff happens, is like then you just start getting excited when you see something that's scary, like cool, it's probably going to be awesome if I actually deal with this thing. And then it's just life becomes pretty fun, but obviously it's easy to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. Yeah, I mean, obviously you can't take that to the total extreme, right? Because you don't want to risk death. But it's always trade-offs. Like you should always think like, what's the upside if it turns out to be great? What's the downside if it turns out I don't like it? And what ends up happening is I think that we get paralyzed by sort of the living in the feeling of failure in the moment that the failure happens, and we don't think like, am I going to really care that I failed in 20 years, right? Because the answer to that question is almost always no when you try something. So I just think like, exactly, like particularly if it's scary, just go ahead and try it because it's not going to be nearly as bad as you think. And if it actually turns out to be great, it's really great.
Yeah, exactly. And a very weird example that sprung to my mind from a chat yesterday in a WhatsApp group was just a series of stories of friends pooing themselves in different places, but no one wants to ever poo themselves in public, but set of hilarious stories in hindsight, and no one really feels that bad about their past experience. But that's like the worst thing you can imagine, I guess, is like being somewhere and then like, yeah.
That's funny. When I would like ground my kids and they'd be really pissed off because they'd be grounded, I would always tell them, I'd say, don't worry, this is going to be so great. Like when you're 40 and we're at Thanksgiving, you're going to be able to like tell everybody about how I was so mean and I grounded you. It's going to be the best. And then they get, they now talk like that. Like, yeah, but it's always, this is going to be so great at Thanksgiving in 20 years.
Yeah, such a good philosophy. And just in general, I think like life is sort of, as in you're the person that lives your life and you're the person that gets to observe it all. And if you think of your life as just one story, like you have to read that entire story. You may as well make it the most interesting story. And if you are making it interesting for yourself, it's probably worth other people reading it and people will want to get involved and hear it. Whereas if you kind of bore yourself every day because you don't do anything that scares you or etc., then
I think that's such a great way to think about it. Like, would you want to read your own story? I love that. I think that's such a good frame.
Cheers. Yeah, that came out with some writing, which is nice. I'm sure other people have thought about that many times before me, but it sounds pretty standard stoic, really. But hey, nice to make things up. Good. Well, this has been lovely. So yeah, this is loads of fun. You're really cool. And thanks so much for the time and sharing so much wisdom.
Thank you so much. This was fun.
Nice.
Glad that we connected.
Me too.
All right. Bye-bye.
Congratulations on listening to a whole episode of the Growth Mindset podcast. Before you race into another podcast, try pausing. Ask yourself, what have you learned? What could you change? How will you make that change happen? Did you press pause? Knowledge is useless without action. What did you learn? What should you change? And how will you make that change happen? You can tell us what you learned by contacting us through the website, growthmindsetpodcast.com, and feel free to connect with us or our guests, or just peruse the show notes. Our Instagram is @growthmindsetpodcast, or follow me @SamJamSnaps for a daily reminder to stop using Instagram. If you enjoy random acts of kindness and want to support the show, you can support us on Patreon or leave us a review on iTunes, and you'll make me very happy. And with that, keep learning and keep growing.